3 days without water in scorching desert heat. 2 million people on the edge of survival. Then, finally, they see it. A well, water, life. They run toward it with desperate hope, drop to their knees, cup their hands, bring the water to their lips, and it's poison, undrinkable, toxic. Their greatest hope becomes their deepest despair in a single moment. But what Moses did next with a single tree changed everything. Not just for them, but for every person who's ever tasted the bitter water of crushing disappointment. Welcome back to Walking with God. I'm so glad you're here for episode 4 of our Wilderness series. If you've been following along, you know we've been exploring why God leads believers into difficult seasons, how those seasons often contradict His promises, and what He's building in us during the process. Today, we're diving into one of the most practical and powerful truths in this entire series. We're talking about what to do when life gives you bitter water, when the thing you desperately hoped for turns out to be disappointing, when the relationship you invested in becomes toxic, when the opportunity you prayed for falls apart, when the breakthrough you expected becomes another setback. These are what I call Marah moments, named after the bitter water experience Israel had in the wilderness. The Hebrew word used here is marah, which literally means bitter. It's the same root word used for bitterness of spirit or soul. And here's what's revolutionary. The way you respond to these moments determines whether you become bitter or better, whether disappointment destroys your faith or deepens it, whether toxic circumstances poison your spirit or purify it. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you the biblical principle that transforms every bitter experience into breakthrough. It's the same principle Moses used at Marah, and it's available to you right now in whatever bitter circumstance you're facing. This isn't positive thinking or denial. This is a supernatural remedy that actually works when properly applied. So if you're dealing with disappointment right now, if something in your life tastes bitter, stay with me. What you're about to learn could change everything. The bitter water crisis. Let's set the scene, because understanding the context makes the miracle even more powerful. Israel had just experienced the greatest deliverance in human history. The Red Sea parted. Their enemies were destroyed. They were free from 400 years of slavery. The celebration must have been incredible. But Exodus chapter 15 tells us what happened next. Moses led them from the Red Sea into the wilderness of Shur, and they traveled for 3 days without finding water. They were dying of thirst. They found water, and it was poison. The very thing that should have saved them would have killed them if they'd consumed it. The anatomy of disappointment. This Marah moment perfectly illustrates what happens to all of us at various points in our journey. We desperately need something. We pray for it. We wait for it. We finally see what looks like the answer. And then we discover it's not what we hoped for at all. Maybe you worked toward a career opportunity, and when you got it, you realized it wasn't what you thought it would be. Maybe you had high hopes for how a situation would resolve, and the resolution was bitter, not sweet. Maybe you invested deeply in a friendship, and that friend betrayed you. Maybe you believed God for a specific outcome, and the outcome was the opposite of what you prayed for. These are Marah moments, and they're profoundly dangerous to your spiritual health because disappointment is a gateway emotion. It can lead you toward either deeper faith or destructive bitterness. Let me explain what I mean by gateway emotion. When you experience disappointment, you're standing at a fork in the road. You can respond with faith, which leads to growth, strength, and increased trust in God's character despite difficult circumstances. Or you can respond with bitterness, which leads to resentment, hardness of heart, and distance from God. Most people don't consciously choose bitterness. It happens gradually. You experience disappointment. You feel justified in your frustration. You rehearse the unfairness of your situation. You compare your circumstances to others who seem blessed. You start questioning God's goodness or His care for you specifically. And before you realize what's happening, bitter roots have grown deep in your heart. Hebrews chapter 12 warns us about this. It says, "See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many." Notice that bitterness doesn't just affect you. It defiles many. It poisons your relationships. It damages your witness. It hurts the people around you. One bitter person can infect an entire family, workplace, or church community. That's why this message is so crucial. Learning to handle disappointment properly isn't just about your personal comfort. It's about protecting your spiritual health and the spiritual health of everyone connected to you. The connection between bitterness and disease. When Moses dealt with the bitter water at Marah, something significant happened that most people miss. After God showed Moses how to make the water sweet, Exodus 15 verse 26 records God saying, "If you will give earnest heed to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his sight, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you which I have put on the Egyptians. For the first, the Lord am your healer." It's not accidental that God spoke about healing immediately after dealing with bitter water. There's a direct connection between bitterness and sickness. Proverbs 14 verse 30 says, "A peaceful heart leads to a healthy body. Jealousy is like cancer in the bones." But the spiritual damage is even worse than the physical damage. Bitterness creates a barrier between you and God. It hardens your heart so you can't hear his voice clearly. It distorts your perception so you interpret everything through a lens of disappointment and suspicion. That's exactly right. When you harbor bitterness towards someone who hurt you, you're not hurting them. You're poisoning yourself. When you hold on to resentment about circumstances that disappointed you, you're not changing those circumstances. You're destroying your own spiritual and emotional health. This is why learning to turn bitter water to sweet isn't optional. It's essential for your survival and flourishing. The tree principle. So what's the solution? How do you actually transform bitter water into sweet water? Exodus 15 verse 25 tells us exactly what happened. Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. And he threw it into the waters, and the waters became sweet. Throughout Scripture, the tree is symbolic of the cross. Deuteronomy 21 tells us that anyone hung on a tree is cursed. Peter refers to Jesus being hung on a tree in Acts chapter 5 and chapter 10. Paul writes in Galatians that Christ redeemed us from the curse by becoming a curse for us, being hung on a tree. So the tree at Marah isn't just a random stick that God used to perform a miracle. It's a prophetic picture of the cross. And the message is profound. The cure for bitter water, for disappointment, for the poison of unfulfilled expectations and broken dreams is the cross. But what does that actually mean, practically? How does the cross turn bitter circumstances sweet? Let me break it down. At the cross, Jesus experienced the ultimate injustice. He was innocent but treated as guilty. He was the source of life but sentenced to death. He came to save but was rejected. He offered love but received hatred. And his response to that ultimate injustice was forgiveness. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The cross demonstrates that forgiveness is the only cure for bitterness. Not pretending you weren't hurt. Not excusing what was done to you. Not denying the injustice or disappointment. But choosing to release the offense, to give up your right to revenge or repayment, and to trust God to be both your defender and your rewarder. This is the tree principle. When you apply the cross to your bitter circumstances through forgiveness, thanksgiving, and trust in God's character, the poison transforms into blessing. Real-life application of the tree. So let's get practical. How do you actually apply the tree principle to your bitter water situations? Let me give you 5 specific steps. First, acknowledge the bitterness honestly. God can't heal what you won't reveal. Come to him with brutal honesty about how you feel. Second, identify specifically what made the water bitter. What was the expectation that wasn't met? What was the hope that was crushed? What was the promise that seemed broken? Be specific. It means you're releasing them from your judgment and giving them to God's judgment. You're refusing to drink the poison of bitterness even though you had legitimate reason to be hurt. Fourth, thank God specifically for what you can see of his character in the situation. Not for the pain itself, but for what you know to be true about him, regardless of the pain. God, I don't understand this, but I thank you that you are still good. I thank you that you still love me. I thank you that you're still working even when I can't see it. Fifth, declare your trust in his redemptive power. This is where you throw the tree into the bitter water. God, I choose to believe that you can bring something beautiful out of this disaster. I choose to trust that you're working this for my good, even though it feels like destruction. I choose to believe that this bitter experience will produce sweet fruit in your timing. When you walk through these 5 steps, something supernatural happens. The circumstances might not change immediately, but something changes inside you. The bitterness loses its grip. Peace begins to flow. You find yourself able to breathe again. This isn't denial or pretending. This is authentic faith that applies the cross principle to your specific pain. The Joseph example. Let me show you this principle in the life of someone who had plenty of reasons to be bitter. Joseph experienced betrayal by his own brothers who sold him into slavery. He experienced false accusation by Potiphar's wife that landed him in prison. He experienced abandonment by the cupbearer who forgot about him for 2 years. Any one of those situations would justify bitterness. All three combined could create a toxic, resentful person consumed by rage. But when Joseph finally stood before his brothers years later, after God had elevated him to Prime Minister of Egypt, he said something remarkable. Genesis 50 verse 20. "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, to bring about the present result, to preserve many people alive." Joseph wasn't excusing what his brothers did. He acknowledged they meant it for evil. He also chose to see God's redemptive purpose in the very situation that could have destroyed him. That's the tree principle in action. Joseph threw the cross into his bitter circumstances. He forgave the unforgivable. Here's what's powerful about Joseph's response. He didn't just avoid bitterness. He actively blessed the very people who had hurt him. The person who had every right to be bitter became the source of blessing. That's what happens when you properly apply the cross to your disappointments. You don't just survive your Mara moments. You emerge from them with the capacity to bless others who are going through similar pain. The opportunity in every trial. Here's a perspective shift that will revolutionize how you view disappointment. Every trial is actually your greatest opportunity to demonstrate faith. Real faith, not the shallow kind that only trusts God when everything is going well. Think about it. Anyone can trust God when they're being blessed. But when the water is bitter, when hope becomes disappointment, when prayers seem unanswered, when circumstances seem to contradict God's character, that's when real faith has the opportunity to shine. This is what Israel failed to understand at Marah. They had just seen God part the Red Sea. They had just experienced the most spectacular miracle in human history. And now they faced a test. Would they trust the character of the God who just delivered them, or would they judge him based on their current circumstances? They chose complaint over faith, and that choice released destructive forces that plagued them throughout their wilderness journey. But imagine if they had responded differently. This is why James wrote, "Count it all joy when you face trials of many kinds, not because trials are fun, but because trials are opportunities. Opportunities to prove that your faith is real. Opportunities to experience God in ways that comfortable Christians never will. Opportunities to develop character that can't be formed any other way. Don't waste your trials by responding with bitterness. Seize them as opportunities to let your faith grow deeper and stronger." The language of faith versus bitterness. There's a direct connection between what comes out of your mouth and what grows in your heart. Complaint is the language of bitterness. Thanksgiving is the language of faith. When Israel found bitter water, they immediately began to grumble against Moses. Exodus 15 verse 24 says, "The people grumbled at Moses, saying, 'What shall we drink?' That complaint revealed the condition of their hearts. And that complaint activated destructive spiritual dynamics that kept them wandering in circles for 40 years. Here's what you need to understand. Complaining doesn't just express bitterness. It creates and deepens bitterness. Every time you rehearse your disappointment, every time you verbalize your frustration, every time you focus on what's wrong rather than what's right, you're watering the bitter root in your heart. But thanksgiving and praise do the opposite. They uproot bitterness and plant faith. Psalm 22 verse 3 says that God inhabits the praises of his people. When you choose to worship God in the midst of bitter circumstances, you create an atmosphere where his presence dwells and his power operate. This doesn't mean you never acknowledge pain or difficulty. Remember, authenticity is important. But there's a difference between honest lament that leads to faith and chronic complaint that leads to bitterness. Lament says, "God, this is hard and I need your help." Complaint says, "This is unfair and you're not doing enough." Lament looks to God for resolution. Complaint accuses God of neglect. Lament ultimately trusts God's character. Complaint questions God's goodness. One of the most powerful things you can do when facing disappointment is to discipline your mouth. Make a conscious choice to speak faith instead of complaint. Thank God for what you can see of his character, even when you can't understand his methods. Declare his promises even when circumstances seem to contradict them. Worship him for who he is, even when you're confused about what he's doing. This isn't fake positivity. This is spiritual warfare. You're fighting against bitterness by speaking the language of faith. The healing promise. Remember what God said immediately after the bitter water was made sweet. "I am the Lord who heals you." That statement reveals God's heart. He doesn't just want to fix your circumstances. He wants to heal the deep wounds that bitter experiences create. Physical healing, emotional healing, spiritual healing. When you properly apply the tree principle, when you choose forgiveness and faith over bitterness and complaint, you position yourself for God's comprehensive healing work. He heals the hurt that the disappointment created. He restores the hope that was crushed. He repairs the trust that was damaged. He renews the joy that was stolen. But healing requires cooperation. God won't force wholeness on you if you're determined to cling to your bitterness. He won't heal what you refuse to release. This is why so many believers stay sick emotionally and spiritually, even though healing is available. They've wrapped their identity around their wounds. They've built their life narrative around their disappointments. They've become so accustomed to bitter water that they don't even recognize they could drink something sweet. If that describes you, hear this. You don't have to stay bitter. You don't have to carry that resentment forever. You don't have to let disappointment define you. God is offering you healing right now, but you have to release the bitterness to receive the healing. You have to throw the tree into your bitter water. You have to apply the cross to your painful circumstances. And when you do, you'll discover that the same God who made bitter water sweet at Marah can make your bitter experiences produce sweet fruit in your life. Key truths. Let me leave you with 3 truths that will help you turn bitter water to sweet. First, disappointment is a gateway emotion. It can lead you toward deeper faith or destructive bitterness. The choice is yours, not based on the circumstances, but based on your response to them. Second, the cross is the cure for bitterness. When you apply forgiveness, thanksgiving, and trust in God's character to your painful situations, poison transforms into blessing. This isn't positive thinking. It's supernatural transformation through the power of the cross. Third, your response to bitter water determines your trajectory. Choose complaint and you'll wander in circles of defeat. Choose worship and you'll move forward into promise. Don't let one Marah moment derail your entire journey to the promised land. So here's the question you need to answer before you click away. Drop your thoughts in the comments. What's your bitter water right now? What disappointment is threatening to poison your faith, your joy, your relationship with God? And more importantly, are you going to drink that poison or are you going to throw the tree into it? Because I can tell you from both scripture and personal experience, the bitter water will either destroy you or develop you. The same circumstances that make some people better make other people bitter. The difference isn't what happens to you. It's what you do with what happens to you. There's a tree available for every bitter situation, a cross that can transform every disappointment, a healing promise waiting for you to receive it. But you have to choose. Will you become bitter or better? The answer to that question will determine everything about your spiritual future. If this message stirred something in your spirit, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who's drinking bitter water right now. Your share could save someone from years of spiritual poisoning. Drop a comment telling me what God spoke to you through this teaching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Tomorrow we're diving into episode 5, and you won't want to miss it. Until then, remember this. The bitter water in front of you is actually your greatest opportunity. Don't waste it.